What if I told you that 10 years before the Mayflower, 150 English colonists vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only empty ships and unanswered questions that have haunted historians for over 400 years? This isn't the story of the lost colony of Roanoke that everyone knows about. This is the story of the third supply mission to Jamestown in 1609, when the largest colonial expedition ever launched by England sailed into the Virginia wilderness and disappeared so thoroughly that even today, we have no idea what happened to them. But here's what they don't want you to know. This wasn't just any group of settlers. These were some of the most experienced colonists, skilled artisans, and military veterans that England had to offer, led by men who had survived wars in Ireland and the Netherlands. They had supplies, weapons, and detailed maps of the Virginia coast. They should have been the salvation of the struggling Jamestown colony. Instead, they became one of American history's greatest mysteries. The year is 1609, and Jamestown is dying for the second time in 3 years. The Virginia Company has already watched hundreds of colonists perish from disease, starvation, and warfare with the Powhatan Confederacy. Captain John Smith, the man who held the colony together through sheer force of will, lies wounded and delirious after a gunpowder explosion nearly killed him. The surviving colonists are preparing to abandon Jamestown entirely and sail back to England when word arrives that salvation is coming. The Virginia Company has organized the largest relief expedition in colonial history. 9 ships carrying over 500 new settlers, enough supplies to last 2 years, and most importantly, a new governor with absolute authority to restore order to the chaos of Virginia. But something goes wrong, catastrophically wrong. When the fleet reached the Virginia coast in August 1609, a massive hurricane scattered the ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. Some ships make it to Jamestown with their human cargo half dead from the voyage. Others are driven so far off course that they end up on islands in the Caribbean. But one ship, carrying 150 of the most vital colonists and the expedition's most crucial supplies, disappears. No wreckage is ever found. No survivors are ever discovered. No trace of their fate is ever uncovered, despite extensive searches by land and sea. These 150 people vanish as entirely as if they never existed, taking with them secrets that could have changed the course of American history. The ship that vanished was called the Virginia, and it carried far more than just colonists and supplies. On board were skilled German glassmakers who were supposed to establish the first industrial manufacturing in the New World. There were Polish artisans with secrets of pitch and tar production that could have made Virginia profitable years earlier than tobacco ever did. There were Irish veterans of the 9 Years' War who understood guerrilla warfare better than any English soldier. There were maps of gold deposits that Spanish explorers had discovered but never exploited. There were diplomatic gifts intended for Powhatan leaders that could have prevented decades of warfare. Most mysteriously, some documents may have contained alternative plans for Virginia's development, plans that would have created a fundamentally different kind of American society. But before we dive into what happened to the Virginia and her 150 souls, you need to understand what was happening in Jamestown in 1609 that made this relief expedition so desperately necessary. The colony that John Smith had held together was falling apart in the most horrific ways imaginable. The colonists weren't just starving, they were eating each other. Literally, archaeological evidence from 2013 confirmed what historians had suspected for centuries. The winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time, saw Jamestown colonists resort to cannibalism to survive. They were eating horses, dogs, cats, rats, shoe leather, and when those ran out, they were eating each other. This wasn't desperation. This was systematic survival cannibalism that continued for months. Dr. Douglas Owsley, the forensic anthropologist who analyzed the remains found at Jamestown, described finding clear evidence of survival cannibalism on the bones of a 14-year-old girl, whom the researchers named Jane. The cut marks on her skull and leg bones showed that colonists had systematically harvested her brain and muscle tissue for food. But Jane wasn't the only victim. Archaeological layers from the starving time contain fragmentary human remains that show similar processing marks. The colonists weren't just dying. They were consuming each other to delay their own deaths in a cycle of horror that makes zombie apocalypse movies seem tame by comparison. This wasn't happening because the colonists were inherently savage or because they had abandoned civilization. This was happening because the colonial food distribution system had collapsed entirely. The Virginia Company had sent colonists without adequate farming knowledge, without proper tools for hunting and fishing, and without sufficient understanding of how to extract food from the Virginia environment. The colonists knew how to be gentlemen, soldiers, and craftsmen, but they didn't know how to be subsistence farmers in an unfamiliar climate, with unfamiliar crops and unpredictable weather patterns. When their imported food ran out and their trade relationships with Native Americans deteriorated into warfare, starvation became inevitable. But the horror of the starving time wasn't just about food. The colonists were also dying from diseases that they had no understanding of and no ability to treat. Typhoid, dysentery, and malaria were killing people faster than starvation could. The colony's water supply came from wells that were contaminated by human waste, creating a cycle of infection that killed healthy adults within days of their arrival. The medical knowledge of 1609 was entirely inadequate for dealing with the disease environment of the Virginia Tidewater. Even the German and Polish artisans who were supposed to save the colony would have been just as vulnerable to these killer diseases as everyone else. The man responsible for organizing the Third Supply Mission was Sir Thomas Smythe, one of the most powerful merchants in England and the treasurer of the Virginia Company. Smythe understood that if Jamestown failed, it wouldn't just be a colonial disaster. It would be a national humiliation that could end English expansion in the New World forever. Spain already controlled most of the Americas. France was establishing colonies in Canada, and the Dutch were building a trading empire in the Caribbean. If England couldn't make a single colony work in Virginia, it would be shut out of the New World entirely. The stakes couldn't have been higher, which is why the Virginia Company committed unprecedented resources to the Third Supply Mission. But Smythe wasn't just thinking about national prestige. He was thinking about money. Enormous amounts of money. The Virginia Company had already invested over 20,000 pounds in the Jamestown colony, equivalent to millions of dollars today. And they had nothing to show for it except reports of death, cannibalism, and complete economic failure. The company's investors were getting restless, and some were demanding that the entire Virginia project be abandoned as a hopeless waste of resources. Smythe knew that if the Third Supply Mission failed, the Virginia Company would go bankrupt and take his personal fortune down with it. This wasn't just about colonial expansion. This was about financial survival for some of England's wealthiest merchants. The fleet that sailed from England in May 1609 represented the most significant single investment in American colonization that had ever been attempted. 9 ships carrying 500 colonists, plus enough food, tools, weapons, and livestock to support 1,000 people for 2 years. The cost was enormous, over 9,000 pounds, which would be millions of dollars today. But more than the money, the Virginia Company was sending its best people. These weren't desperate criminals or unemployed laborers like many earlier colonial expeditions. These were skilled artisans, experienced soldiers, educated gentlemen, and their families. The Virginia Company was betting everything on this mission, and they sent their absolute best to ensure it succeeded. The German courtesans aboard the Virginia were particularly valuable because they possessed industrial secrets that could revolutionize colonial economics. These weren't just general laborers. They were master glassmakers who understood the complex chemistry of creating high-quality glass from raw materials. In 1609, glass was an incredibly valuable commodity. Good glass had to be imported from Venice at enormous cost, and the ability to produce glass locally could make a colony economically self-sufficient almost overnight. The German glassmakers carried knowledge of furnace construction, chemical formulations, and production techniques that were closely guarded trade secrets. If they had reached Jamestown safely, Virginia might have become profitable through glass production decades before tobacco cultivation was perfected. The Polish artisans are equally valuable for different reasons. Poland was the leading European producer of naval stores, the pitch, tar, and turpentine that were essential for maintaining wooden ships. Every navy in Europe depended on Polish naval stores, and England was constantly worried about being cut off from these supplies during wartime. The Polish artisans aboard the Virginia understood how to extract these materials from pine forests, and Virginia had vast pine forests that could have supplied the entire English Navy. If these craftsmen had reached Jamestown, Virginia could have become strategically indispensable to English naval power while generating enormous profits from the production of maritime stores. The Irish military veterans aboard the Virginia represented a different kind of expertise that could have transformed colonial Native American relations. These men had fought in the 9 Years' War in Ireland, where English forces had learned hard lessons about fighting guerrilla campaigns against indigenous peoples who knew the terrain better than the invaders did. The Irish veterans understood how to build fortifications that could withstand siege warfare, how to conduct reconnaissance in unfamiliar territory, and how to negotiate with hostile tribes from a position of strength rather than desperation. If these veterans had reached Jamestown, colonial defenses might have been strong enough to deter Powhatan attacks and create space for more cooperative relationships with Native American peoples. But perhaps most intriguingly, the Virginia was carrying documents that may have contained alternative plans for colonial development. The Virginia Company had been debating different approaches to making Virginia profitable, and not all of these approaches depended on plantation agriculture worked by bound laborers. Some company officials favored industrial development that would employ free-wage laborers. Others supported mixed farming that would create independent yeoman communities. Still others advocated for trading relationships with Native Americans that would generate profits without requiring large-scale European settlement. The documents aboard the Virginia may have included detailed plans for these alternative approaches to colonial development. Leading the expedition was Sir Thomas Gates, recently appointed as the first official governor of Virginia with powers that bordered on dictatorial. Gates was a veteran of military campaigns in the Low Countries and Ireland, a man who understood both warfare and administration. But Gates wasn't just a military leader. He was also a visionary who understood that successful colonization required more than just military conquest. He had studied Spanish colonial methods in the Caribbean and understood how to create sustainable colonial economies that could support large European populations. Gates was carrying detailed plans for reorganizing Virginia's government, economy, and society, according to principles that had proven successful in other colonial contexts. Accompanying Gates was Sir George Somers, one of England's most experienced naval commanders and a founding member of the Virginia Company. Somers had spent decades navigating the Atlantic and understood the dangers of colonial voyages better than almost anyone alive. He had survived storms, pirates, disease outbreaks, and navigation errors that had destroyed other expeditions. If anyone could get the third supply fleet safely to Virginia, it should have been Somers. But Somers was carrying more than just navigational expertise. He was also carrying maps and charts that showed potential harbors, river systems, and inland territories that could be developed for colonial expansion. These maps represented years of Spanish and French exploration that had been acquired through espionage and diplomacy. The fleet sailed from Plymouth on May 15, 1609, following the standard Atlantic route that took advantage of prevailing winds and currents. For the first 6 weeks, everything went according to plan. The ships stayed together, the weather was favorable, and morale among the colonists was high. They were sailing to rescue a failing colony, but they were also sailing to claim their piece of the New World. Many of these colonists had sold everything they owned to buy passage to Virginia. They were carrying their entire life savings and all their worldly possessions. They weren't just risking their lives. They were risking their futures on the promise that Virginia could become the foundation of a new life. The passengers aboard the Virginia represented a cross-section of English society that was remarkably diverse for a 17th century colonial expedition. There were gentlemen investors who had bought shares in the Virginia Company and were traveling to Virginia to oversee their investments personally. Some skilled craftsmen had been recruited specifically for their technical expertise. Some laborers had signed indenture contracts in exchange for passage to the New World. Some soldiers had been promised land grants in exchange for military service. There were even a few women and children, families who were planning to establish permanent homesteads in Virginia rather than extract wealth and return to England. Among the passengers were individuals whose stories reveal the human dimensions of the Virginia's disappearance. Thomas Powell was a master carpenter from London who had been recruited to build the sawmills and workshops that would support Virginia's industrial development. He was traveling with his wife, Mary, and their 2 young children, planning to establish a furniture-making business that would serve colonial markets. William Morrison was a veteran of the Irish Wars who had been promised 100 acres of Virginia land in exchange for training colonial militias. He was carrying detailed military engineering manuals that described how to build fortifications capable of withstanding both European and Native American attacks. Margaret Fleming was one of only 12 women aboard the Virginia, traveling to Virginia to marry a colonist she had never met, but who had paid her passage in exchange for her agreement to become his wife. She was carrying a small dowry of household goods and personal possessions that represented everything she owned in the world. Robert Schneider was one of the German glassmakers who carried carefully protected samples of the special sand and chemicals needed to produce high-quality glass. He had been promised a partnership in the Virginia Glass Works and planned to send for his extended family once the operation was established. But on July 24, 1609, the fleet encountered something that would change the course of American history. A massive hurricane, one of the worst Atlantic storms of the 17th century, caught the ships just as they were approaching the Virginia coast. For 3 days and nights, winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and waves over 40 feet high battered the fleet. The ships lost visual contact with each other almost immediately, and each captain had to make individual decisions about how to survive the storm. Some vessels rode out the hurricane and limped into Jamestown. Others were blown hundreds of miles off course, but eventually found their way to Virginia. But the Virginia, carrying 150 colonists and some of the expedition's most crucial supplies, was never seen again. Hurricane research conducted by modern meteorologists suggests that the storm that scattered the 3rd Supply Fleet was what we would now classify as a Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of at least 130 miles per hour. Computer modeling based on historical weather data indicates that the storm formed in the Caribbean and tracked northward along the American coast, reaching maximum intensity just as it encountered the English fleet. The timing couldn't have been worse. The ships were close enough to shore to be caught in the storm's most destructive winds, but too far from safe harbors to find shelter before the worst weather hit. The hurricane's impact on the fleet was devastating beyond anything the Virginia Company had anticipated. The flagship, carrying Governor Gates and Admiral Summers, was driven aground on the uninhabited island of Bermuda and wouldn't reach Virginia for almost a year. The ship carrying most of the expedition's horses and livestock was so severely damaged that the animals had to be thrown overboard to prevent the boat from sinking. The vessel, carrying the medical supplies and medicines needed to treat diseases in Virginia, was blown so far off course that it didn't reach Jamestown for 6 months. But the Virginia, which was supposed to be one of the most seaworthy ships in the fleet, vanished. Here's where the story becomes truly mysterious. The Virginia wasn't just any ship in the fleet. It was one of the newest and most seaworthy vessels the Virginia Company owned. Built specifically for Atlantic crossings, with experienced officers and a proven track record of successful voyages. The ship's captain, Christopher Newport, was one of the most skilled navigators of his generation, a man who had already made multiple successful trips to Virginia. Newport had previously survived pirate attacks, severe storms, and navigation errors that had destroyed other expeditions. If any ship should have survived the hurricane, it should have been the Virginia. But somehow, this ship, with this crew, carrying these colonists, vanished so completely that not a single piece of wreckage was ever recovered. The immediate assumption was that the Virginia had been driven south by the hurricane and wrecked somewhere along the Carolina coast. Search parties were organized from Jamestown, and Spanish ships were asked to watch for wreckage or survivors along the Florida coast. Native American tribes throughout the region were questioned about strange ships or foreign survivors. Every inlet, every barrier island, every possible refuge along hundreds of miles of coastline was searched, but nothing was found. No wreckage, no survivors, no trace that the Virginia had ever existed. It was as if the ship and everyone aboard had been erased from reality. But here's what makes this disappearance even more mysterious. The Virginia was carrying something that made it is uniquely valuable to anyone who might have captured it. Along with the 150 colonists were artisans who possessed industrial secrets that could revolutionize colonial economics. The German glassmakers aboard the Virginia knew techniques for producing high-quality glass that could compete with Venetian imports. The Polish pitch and tar experts could have made Virginia profitable through naval stores production, something that wouldn't actually happen until decades later. The Irish military veterans carried knowledge of fortress construction and guerrilla warfare that could have changed the balance of power in colonial conflicts. Anyone who captured this ship wouldn't just have gained colonists, they would have gained access to technologies and knowledge that could transform a colonial economy. This raises the possibility that the Virginia didn't sink in the hurricane at all. Maybe it was captured, but by whom? And where were the captors taken? Spanish ships regularly patrolled the Florida coast and could have intercepted a storm-damaged English vessel. The Spanish had been tracking English colonial activities in Virginia with growing alarm, and capturing a ship full of skilled English artisans would have been both a strategic victory and a source of valuable intelligence about English colonial plans. Spanish colonial records from the period contain intriguing references to English prisoners with specialized skills being forced to work in silver mines and shipyards throughout the Spanish Empire. French pirates operated throughout the Caribbean and might have seized a valuable prize like the storm-damaged Virginia. French colonial officials were constantly looking for skilled European artisans to develop their own colonial industries, and they weren't particularly concerned about the nationality of the artisans they employed. French colonial records from settlements in the Caribbean contain references to European artisans of uncertain origins appearing in French communities during this period. Some of these references describe craftsperson glassmaking and metalworking skills that match the specialties of the Virginia's passengers. Even more intriguingly, there were persistent rumors of English pirates working with Spanish authorities to capture English colonial expeditions. The line between legal privateering and outright piracy was often blurry in the early 17th century, and a ship full of skilled craftsmen and colonial supplies would have been an irresistible target for anyone willing to operate outside the law. English pirates might have captured the Virginia during the confusion of the hurricane and sold the passengers and cargo to Spanish colonial authorities, who were willing to pay reasonable prices for English artisans and intelligence about English colonial activities. But if the Virginia was captured rather than sunk, what happened to the 150 people aboard? Historical records from Spanish colonies in the period show occasional references to English prisoners with specialized skills being forced to work in Spanish mines or shipyards. These references are frustratingly vague, but they suggest that captured English colonists might have been absorbed into Spanish colonial society rather than being executed or returned to English authorities. Spanish colonial officials were pragmatic people who understood the value of skilled European laborers, regardless of their nationality or religion. French colonial records mention English artisans appearing in Caribbean settlements under mysterious circumstances. Some of these records describe European artisans who claimed to be shipwreck survivors, but whose stories didn't quite match any known shipwrecks. Could some of these mysterious craftsmen have been passengers from the Virginia who had survived captivity and eventually gained enough freedom to start new lives under different identities? The French colonial authorities weren't particularly interested in investigating the backgrounds of skilled workers who could contribute to colonial development. Even more tantalizingly, Native American oral histories from the period contain stories of European strangers arriving in coastal communities and being absorbed into tribal societies. These stories describe shipwrecked foreigners who learned native languages, adopted native customs, and eventually became full members of native communities. Some of these stories include details about Europeans with specialized skills in metalworking and construction that match the expertise of Virginia's passengers. Could some of the Virginia colonists have survived a shipwreck and started new lives as members of Native American societies? The possibility that Virginia passengers survived and integrated into other communities raises profound questions about identity and survival in the early colonial period. The boundaries between European and Native American societies were much more fluid than later generations would acknowledge. Captured colonists often adopted native customs and languages so entirely that they refused to return to European communities when given the opportunity. Native Americans sometimes joined European communities and adopted European customs with equal completeness. In the chaos of early colonial contact, people regularly crossed cultural boundaries and created new identities that defied the ethnic and national categories that we now take for granted. The disappearance of the Virginia had immediate and catastrophic consequences for Jamestown. The supplies lost with the ship included most of the medical equipment and medicines intended to treat the diseases ravaging the colony. The skilled artisans who vanished were supposed to establish industries that could make Virginia economically self-sufficient. The military veterans who disappeared were supposed to organize defenses against Powhatan attacks that were intensifying as colonial pressure on native lands increased. Without these people and supplies, Jamestown entered the starving time even more vulnerable than before. The medical consequences were particularly severe. The Virginia was carrying the only qualified physician in the entire third supply expedition, along with medical instruments, medicines, and surgical supplies that were desperately needed in Jamestown. Dr. Lawrence Bohun was one of the most experienced colonial physicians of his generation, having studied tropical diseases in the Caribbean and understood how to treat the ailments that were killing Virginia colonists. Without Dr. Bohun and his medical supplies, the colonists had no effective treatment for the typhoid, dysentery, and malaria that would kill hundreds of people during the starving time. The industrial consequences were equally devastating. The German glassmakers were supposed to establish Virginia's first manufacturing industry within months of their arrival. Glass production could have generated enough revenue to make Virginia economically self-sufficient without depending on tobacco cultivation or other labor-intensive agriculture. The Polish naval stores experts were supposed to begin extracting pitch and tar from Virginia's pine forests, creating another source of revenue that could have supported the colony's development. Without these craftsmen, Virginia remained dependent on agriculture and trade relationships that proved inadequate for colonial survival. The military consequences were perhaps most serious of all. The Irish veterans were supposed to train colonial militias and organize defenses that could deter Powhatan attacks. These men understood how to build fortifications that could withstand siege warfare, how to conduct reconnaissance in hostile territory, and how to negotiate with indigenous peoples from a position of strength. Without these veterans, colonial defenses remained weak and poorly organized, making the colony vulnerable to the attacks that would devastate the settlement during the starving time. But the psychological impact was almost as devastating as the material losses. The colonists who did reach Jamestown brought news that the largest relief expedition in colonial history had been scattered and partly destroyed before it could provide meaningful help. This wasn't just bad luck. This felt like divine judgment against the entire colonial enterprise. Many colonists began to believe that God was actively opposing English settlement in Virginia, that the land itself was cursed, that no European society could ever succeed in this New World wilderness. The disappearance of the Virginia became a symbol of colonial failure that haunted English expansion efforts for years. The religious implications of Virginia's disappearance were profound for a society that interpreted natural disasters as expressions of divine will. Colonial ministers preached that the hurricane and the ship's disappearance were punishments for the moral failures of the Virginia Company and its colonists. Some argued that God was opposing English colonization because the colonists had failed to convert Native Americans to Christianity. Others claimed that the disaster was punishment for the greed and materialism that motivated colonial expansion. Still others suggested that Virginia itself was a cursed land that would never support Christian civilization. These religious interpretations had practical consequences that made colonial recovery even more difficult. Some colonists refused to work on projects that they believed were contrary to God's will. Others demanded that colonial leaders abandon their expansion plans and focus entirely on religious conversion activities. Still others argued that the entire Virginia project should be abandoned as evidence that God intended America to remain under Native American control. The disappearance of the Virginia provided religious ammunition for opponents of colonial expansion, who argued that the disaster proved that English colonization violated divine law. Meanwhile, the survivors of the hurricane flagship, including Governor Gates and Admiral Summers, found themselves shipwrecked on an uninhabited island in Bermuda. For 10 months, they built new ships and struggled to reach Virginia, not knowing whether Jamestown had survived the winter. The Bermuda castaways faced their own survival challenges, but they also had opportunities that the Virginia passengers never got. The island provided fresh water, abundant food, and materials for shipbuilding. The castaways were able to construct 2 new vessels and eventually complete their journey to Virginia. The Bermuda survivors' experience provides a stark contrast to the fate of Virginia's passengers. While the Bermuda castaways were building ships and preparing to continue their voyage, the Virginia's passengers had vanished. No island refuge, no opportunity to make new vessels, no chance to complete their journey. The difference between survival and disappearance often came down to nothing more than which ship passengers had chosen for their passage to the New World. The arbitrary nature of survival in early colonial expeditions is one of the most sobering aspects of Virginia's story. When Gates and Summers finally arrived in May 1610, they found the colony in complete collapse. The surviving colonists were literally loading ships to abandon Jamestown forever when Gates's rescue fleet appeared on the horizon. The colonists had endured the starving time without the medical supplies, skilled artisans, and military expertise that had vanished with the Virginia. The loss of the ship had contributed to bringing English colonization of America to within hours of complete failure. If Gates had arrived even one day later, Jamestown might have been abandoned permanently, and English colonization of North America might have ended before it really began. But here's what's truly remarkable about the Virginia mystery. The ship's disappearance changed the character of American colonization in ways that are still visible today. The loss of the German glassmakers delayed industrial development in Virginia for decades, keeping the colony dependent on tobacco agriculture. The loss of the Polish naval stores experts meant that Virginia couldn't exploit one of its most valuable natural resources until much later. The loss of the Irish military veterans contributed to colonial vulnerability in conflicts with Native Americans. The disappearance of the Virginia didn't just cost 150 lives. It altered the entire trajectory of American economic and social development. Consider what American history might have looked like if the Virginia had reached Jamestown safely. Industrial manufacturing might have developed in Virginia decades earlier than it actually did. The colony might have become economically viable without depending so heavily on tobacco cultivation and enslaved labor. The alternative history that vanished with the Virginia is particularly intriguing when we consider the documents that may have been aboard the ship. The Virginia Company had been debating different models for colonial development, and not all of these models depended on plantation agriculture worked by bound laborers. Some company officials favored manufacturing development that would employ free-wage workers. Others supported diversified farming that would create independent communities of landowning families. Still others advocated for trading relationships with Native Americans that would generate profits without requiring large-scale European settlement. If Virginia had carried detailed plans for these alternative approaches to colonial development, and if these plans had been implemented successfully, American society might have developed along very different lines. Instead of the plantation system that came to dominate colonial agriculture, Virginia might have created a manufacturing economy that provided opportunities for social mobility. Instead of the conflicts with Native Americans that characterized colonial expansion, Virginia might have developed trading relationships that benefited both European and Native American communities. Instead of the dependence on bound labor that shaped American society for centuries, Virginia might have developed free labor systems that promoted equality and individual opportunity. The documents that vanished with the Virginia might also have included alternative plans for colonial governance that could have created more democratic and representative institutions. The Virginia Company had been experimenting with different approaches to colonial administration, including systems that would have given colonists more control over their own affairs, and Native Americans more voice in decisions that affected their lands. If these alternative governance plans had been implemented, American political development might have followed a more democratic and inclusive path from the very beginning. The search for the Virginia continued sporadically for years after 1609, but gradually the mystery was overshadowed by more immediate colonial concerns. The colonists who survived the starving time had to focus on rebuilding Jamestown and establishing sustainable agriculture. The Virginia Company had to manage a financial crisis caused by the enormous losses of the Third Supply Mission. Colonial administrators had to deal with ongoing conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy and the constant threat of Spanish attacks. Gradually, the fate of the Virginia and her 150 passengers became a historical footnote rather than an active investigation. But the mystery never completely disappeared. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, occasional reports surfaced of possible Virginia survivors or wreckage. Spanish colonial records contained references to English prisoners with specialized skills. French Caribbean documents mentioned European artisans of uncertain origins. Native American communities along the coast preserved stories of shipwrecked foreigners who had joined their societies. None of these reports could be definitively connected to the Virginia, but they kept alive the possibility that some of the ship's passengers had survived their disappearance. The most intriguing of these reports came from Spanish colonial officials in Florida who described English prisoners working in shipyards and silver mines throughout the Spanish Empire. These reports mentioned skilled courtesans who claimed to be shipwreck survivors, but whose stories didn't match any known English shipwrecks. Some of these prisoners reportedly possessed knowledge of glassmaking and metalworking that was unusually advanced for their claimed backgrounds. Could these mysterious English prisoners have been passengers from the Virginia who had survived capture and been forced into Spanish colonial service? French colonial records from the Caribbean contain similar references to European artisans who appeared in French settlements under mysterious circumstances. These records describe artisans with specialized skills who claimed to be refugees from various European conflicts, but whose stories contained inconsistencies that suggested more complicated origins. Some of these craftsmen reportedly possessed knowledge of naval stores production and fortress construction that matched the expertise of the Virginia's passengers. The French colonial authorities weren't particularly interested in investigating these inconsistencies as long as the courtesans contributed to colonial development. Native American oral histories from the period preserve the most intriguing possibilities for Virginia survivor stories. These histories describe shipwrecked Europeans who were rescued by coastal tribes and eventually integrated into Native American communities. Some of these stories include specific details about European metalworking and construction techniques that match the specialties of Virginia's passengers. The oral histories suggest that some shipwreck survivors not only learned native languages and customs, but also taught European techniques to their adoptive communities, creating hybrid technologies that combined European and Native American knowledge. Modern archaeological investigations have provided tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. Underwater surveys along the Carolina coast have discovered numerous 17th century shipwrecks, but none can be positively identified as the Virginia. The challenges of underwater archaeology in the Atlantic are enormous. Centuries of storms, shifting sands, and marine growth have obscured or destroyed most traces of early shipwrecks. Even if Virginia's remains were discovered, identifying them conclusively would require finding artifacts or structural features that could be linked definitively to the ship. Excavations of colonial sites have uncovered European artifacts in unexpected locations, suggesting the presence of colonists who don't appear in official records. Some of these artifacts include glassmaking tools and metalworking equipment that indicate the presence of skilled artisans whose identities and origins remain unknown. Archaeological evidence from Native American sites has revealed European trade goods and technological innovations that predate known European contact in those areas. These discoveries hint at the possibility that European courtesans may have been working in Native American communities earlier than official records suggest. Analysis of Native American sites from the period has revealed evidence of European contact that doesn't match known colonial activities. Some sites contain European-style metalwork and construction techniques that appear earlier than documented European settlement in those areas. Other sites show evidence of glassmaking and other European industrial activities that don't correspond to any known European settlements. These archaeological anomalies could represent the activities of Virginia passengers who survived the ship's disappearance and integrated into Native American communities. But perhaps the most intriguing clues come from genetic analysis of modern populations along the Atlantic coast. Recent DNA studies have identified European genetic markers in Native American communities that known historical contacts can't explain. Some of these markers suggest Irish and German ancestry that predates known Irish and German immigration to the region. The genetic evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. European genetic markers could have entered Native American populations through many different routes, including captured colonists from various shipwrecks and colonial conflicts. The genetic evidence becomes more intriguing when combined with oral histories and archaeological findings. Native American communities that preserve stories of shipwrecked Europeans also show elevated levels of European genetic markers that predate known European settlement. Archaeological sites associated with these communities show evidence of European technological knowledge that appeared earlier than documented European contact. The combination of genetic, archaeological, and oral evidence suggests that some Europeans may have integrated into Native American communities during the early colonial period, but definitively connecting this evidence to the Virginia's passengers remains impossible. The disappearance of the Virginia also reveals something crucial about the nature of early colonial expansion. Despite careful planning, experienced leadership, and substantial investment, colonial expeditions remained incredibly vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Weather, disease, navigation errors, and hostile encounters could destroy years of preparation and investment in a matter of days. The Virginia Company's decision to send its best people and most valuable resources on a single expedition was rational from a business perspective. Still, it created catastrophic vulnerability when things went wrong. The loss of the Virginia taught colonial organizers harsh lessons about risk management that would influence expansion strategies for generations. The financial impact of Virginia's loss was staggering for the Virginia Company. The ship and its cargo represented a massive investment that could never be recovered. The passengers had paid substantial sums for their passage, money that would have to be refunded to surviving family members. The specialized equipment and supplies that went down with the ship had to be replaced at enormous cost. The Virginia Company was already operating on thin financial margins, and the loss of Virginia pushed the company toward the bankruptcy that would eventually end its control of Virginia. The disappearance of one ship contributed to fundamentally altering the ownership and governance of English colonial America. The human stories behind Virginia's disappearance are perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the mystery. Among the 150 passengers were entire families who had sold everything to start new lives in Virginia. Young couples were planning to establish homesteads and raise children in the New World. Skilled artisans were hoping to build prosperous businesses serving colonial markets. There were soldiers and administrators seeking career advancement in colonial service. Each of these people had dreams, plans, and loved ones waiting for news of their safe arrival. When the Virginia vanished, all of these individual hopes and aspirations disappeared with it. The story of Margaret Fleming illustrates the personal tragedies hidden within Virginia's disappearance. Margaret was traveling to Virginia to marry a colonist she had never met, carrying a small dowry of household goods that represented everything she owned. Her intended husband had already paid for her passage and was expecting her arrival to begin their new life together. When the Virginia disappeared, Margaret's fiancé waited months for news of her fate before accepting that she was probably dead. He eventually married another woman, but colonial records suggest that he never completely gave up hope that Margaret might somehow have survived and would eventually return to Virginia. Thomas Powell's story represents the artisans whose skills were lost with the sinking of the Virginia. Powell was a master carpenter who had been recruited specifically to build the sawmills and workshops that would support Virginia's industrial development. He was traveling with his wife, Mary, and their 2 young children, planning to establish a furniture-making business to serve the growing colonial markets. Powell had invested his life savings in tools and equipment that were aboard the Virginia, and his family had sold their house in London to pay for their passage. When the ship disappeared, the Powell family's entire future vanished with it. Robert Schneider's story illustrates the industrial implications of Virginia's loss. Schneider was one of the German glassmakers carrying carefully protected samples of the special sand and chemicals needed to produce high-quality glass. He had been promised a partnership in the Virginia Glass Works and had made detailed plans for establishing glass production that could compete with expensive European imports. Schneider's knowledge and equipment could have made Virginia economically self-sufficient decades earlier than actually happened, but all of that potential vanished when Virginia disappeared. The Virginia mystery also demonstrates the remarkable resilience of colonial expansion. Despite the catastrophic losses of 1609, English colonization of Virginia ultimately succeeded. Jamestown survived the starving time. Tobacco cultivation eventually made the colony profitable, and Virginia became the foundation of English expansion across North America. The disappearance of the Virginia was a significant setback, but it wasn't a fatal blow to the colonial project. Colonial organizers learned from the disaster, developed better risk management strategies, and continued sending expeditions to the New World. The mystery of the Virginia became part of the larger story of colonial persistence in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The lessons learned from the Virginia's disappearance influenced colonial planning for generations. Future expeditions spread their passengers and cargo across multiple ships to reduce the risk of total loss. Colonial organizers developed backup plans for replacing lost specialists and equipment. Ships began traveling in smaller groups that could provide mutual assistance during storms and other emergencies. The Virginia Company's catastrophic losses in 1609 taught English colonial organizers that successful expansion required careful risk management and redundant planning. Modern attempts to solve the Virginia mystery have employed cutting-edge technology and interdisciplinary research methods. Satellite imagery has been used to identify potential wreck sites along the Atlantic coast. Computer modeling has attempted to reconstruct the hurricane's path and determine where storm-damaged ships might have sought shelter. Marine archaeologists have surveyed underwater sites using side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles. Historians have combed through archives in Spain, France, and England, looking for any reference to captured English colonists or mysterious shipwrecks. Despite all these efforts, Virginia's fate remains unknown. The technological challenges of solving the Virginia mystery are enormous. 4 centuries of Atlantic storms have shifted millions of tons of sand and sediment along the coast, potentially burying any wreckage beyond the reach of current archaeological methods. The wooden construction of the 17th century ships means that marine borers and decay would have destroyed any remains unless they were buried immediately in oxygen-free sediments. Even if Virginia's wreckage were perfectly preserved, finding it among thousands of square miles of ocean floor would require resources and technology that exceed current capabilities. The documentary challenges are equally formidable. Colonial record-keeping in 1609 was incomplete and inconsistent, and many records have been lost to wars, fires, and neglect over the centuries. Spanish colonial archives contain thousands of documents that have never been fully translated or analyzed. French colonial records are scattered across archives in France, Canada, and the Caribbean. Native American oral histories have been transmitted through generations with inevitable changes and modifications. Piecing together the documentary evidence for Virginia's fate would require years of research in dozens of archives across multiple countries. The genetic challenges of connecting modern populations to Virginia passengers are equally complex. European genetic markers entered Native American populations through many different routes over several centuries, making it impossible to connect specific genetic signatures to particular historical events. The small number of people involved in Virginia's disappearance means that any genetic traces would be diluted by centuries of subsequent European contact. Even if Virginia passengers did integrate into Native American communities, proving their presence through genetic analysis would require DNA samples and historical documentation that may not exist. Despite these challenges, discoveries continue to shed light on early colonial history and keep alive the possibility that the Virginia mystery might eventually be solved. Archaeological excavations at Jamestown have revealed how desperate the colonial situation was in 1609. Confirming that Virginia's supplies could have made the difference between survival and abandonment. Underwater archaeology along the Atlantic coast continues to discover new shipwrecks from the colonial period, each one providing new insights into the hazards of early Atlantic navigation. Genetic studies of Native American populations continue to reveal evidence of early European contact that doesn't match known historical records. Virginia's story also illuminates the arbitrary nature of historical survival. The passengers who chose the Virginia for their passage to the New World made a rational decision based on the ship's reputation and experienced crew. They had no way of knowing that their choice would lead to the complete disappearance, while passengers on other boats would survive to become part of American history. The difference between historical significance and historical oblivion often came down to nothing more than which ship passengers happened to choose for their journey to the New World. This arbitrary quality of historical survival extends beyond individual passengers to the larger patterns of American development. If Virginia had reached Jamestown safely, American economic growth might have followed industrial rather than agricultural patterns. If the ship's military veterans had established effective colonial defenses, relationships with Native Americans might have developed more cooperatively. If the artisans had established successful manufacturing operations, Virginia might have attracted different types of immigrants and developed different social structures. The disappearance of the Virginia removed possibilities from American history that we can imagine but never know. The Virginia mystery also reveals how much early American history depended on individual knowledge and expertise that could be lost in a single disaster. The German glassmakers carried technical knowledge that existed nowhere else in English colonial America. The Polish naval stores experts possessed skills that would take decades to redevelop. The Irish military veterans understood warfare techniques that could have changed the outcome of colonial conflicts. When the Virginia disappeared, this irreplaceable human knowledge vanished with it, forcing colonial development to follow different paths than initially planned. The implications extend beyond the immediate colonial period to the larger patterns of American development. The loss of Virginia's industrial potential meant that American manufacturing development was delayed for decades, making the colonies more dependent on agricultural exports and imported manufactured goods. The loss of the ship's military expertise contributed to colonial vulnerability that shaped relationships with both Native Americans and European rivals. The loss of the planned industrial development may have contributed to the eventual dependence on enslaved labor that became central to colonial economic development. The disappearance of the Virginia in 1609 is considered one of the great turning points in American history that never occurred. If the ship had reached Jamestown safely, American development might have followed a completely different trajectory. Industrial manufacturing might have developed earlier, colonial agriculture might have diversified beyond tobacco, and relationships with Native American peoples might have evolved differently. The Virginia carried not just people and supplies, but possibilities for alternative futures that vanished along with the ship. Understanding what was lost with the Virginia helps us comprehend what actually happened in American history by illustrating what might have occurred instead. The mystery continues to evolve as new evidence emerges and new technologies become available. Recent archaeological discoveries at early colonial sites have revealed evidence of European activities that don't match known historical records. Genetic studies continue to identify European ancestry in Native American populations that predates documented European settlement. Historical research continues to uncover references to mysterious European artisans in Spanish and French colonial records. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, but the complete picture of Virginia's fate remains elusive. Today, more than 400 years after the Virginia vanished, the mystery continues to fascinate historians, archaeologists, and amateur investigators. New technologies offer hope that the ship might someday be found and its secrets revealed. Genetic analysis might eventually confirm whether some passengers survived and integrated into other communities. Archaeological discoveries might uncover evidence of where the Virginia's passengers ended up. But even if the mystery is never solved, the disappearance of the Virginia remains a powerful reminder of how much early American history depended on chance, luck, and forces beyond human control. The 150 people who vanished with the Virginia were more than just colonial statistics. They were individuals with names, families, and stories that deserve to be remembered, even if their fate remains unknown. They represent thousands of other early colonists whose stories have been lost to history. People who risked everything to build a new society in a dangerous world. Their disappearance reminds us that American history could have developed in countless different ways, that the patterns we now take for granted were never inevitable, and that our understanding of the past is shaped as much by what we don't know as by what we do know. The Virginia and her 150 souls remain somewhere out there, waiting to be discovered. Maybe buried under centuries of sand on some remote beach, scattered across the ocean floor, or maybe preserved in some archive that hasn't been properly searched. The mystery that began in 1609 continues today, one of American history's most fantastic unsolved puzzles. But even if Virginia is never found, her disappearance has already taught us crucial lessons about the fragility of colonial expansion, the importance of individual lives in historical change, and the role of chance in shaping the development of nations. The ship that vanished without a trace left behind a mystery, revealing profound truths about the arbitrary nature of historical survival and the alternative futures that disappeared along with the 150 souls who sailed into the storm and never returned. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because the real stories of American history are just beginning to be told.